Hey guys, so many people today are worried about our actions causing greenhouse emissions and are willing to change their habits in order to stop that. Many people these days will refuse to travel with an airplane because airplanes emit a lot of greenhouse gases. Some people will refuse to eat meat because of that, but those same people often drink milk every breakfast, and milk is food production of which emits most greenhouse gases. That is, it emits relatively large amounts of methane, the greenhouse gas which is a few times more powerful than CO2. It accounts for more greenhouse gas effect than airplanes do. Now, a guy called Peer Ederer, I guess that's how it's pronounced for he's a German, published a YouTube video in which he tries to refute that. If you look up his name on some search engine, you will probably find this claim of him. Yeah, that's the kind of guy we are dealing here. Tobacco was, according to him, marginalized not because science says it should be marginalized, but solely for political reasons. Also, I will say this right away. I think any discussion about the environmental aspect of meat and milk, which doesn't mention the fact that factory farming, the way the vast majority of meat and most of the milk is produced today, leads to the development of superbacteria, I think that such a discussion is a big red herring. That video doesn't mention superbacteria. I don't know if this is because Peer Ederer is dishonest or hasn't researched the topic. Superbacteria are a much bigger concern than global warming is. The Earth has warmed and cooled in the past much more than the greenhouse gases we emit will have an effect to warm it and human race survive. Human race has not yet had to deal with superbacteria. Given that, I kind of agree with that video that discussing how milk and meat industry contributes to global warming is counterproductive, but for a different reason. It's not because it's not happening, it's because the exact policies that make milk industry emit less methane make us more vulnerable to superbacteria. Namely, cows produce methane when they digest fiber, that is cellulose. Cellulose is basically made of glucose molecules connected with each other with methane molecules. Most animals, including humans, can't usefully digest cellulose, but cows not only can, they need so to stay healthy. And the grass contains a lot of cellulose. And the way to make cows emit less methane is, well, not to feed them with grass, but with something that contains significantly less fiber, such as grain. And grain-fed cows are, of course, usually kept in small and dirty places and need to be given antibiotics to stay healthy. And that's where the vast majority of antibiotics goes today, and overuse of antibiotics leads to development of superbacteria. For those of you who don't know, my name is Teo Samarjia. I'm studying computer science at the FERIT University. I don't have any special qualifications to talk about those things, but guess what? Neither does Peer Ederer. He has a PhD in economics, which is completely unrelated to the claims he makes in that video, but I guess it makes him feel qualified to contradict the scientific consensus in fields unrelated to his expertise. Anyway, let's respond to the claims he made in that video. Yeah, people around the world are deficient in lysine, and those same people are probably also horribly deficient in vitamin K and are also lactose intolerant. So let's feed them with milk. How come nobody has thought of that? I don't have a solution for hunger in the world, but you don't have to know the right answer to recognize a wrong one.
Long shelves in supermarkets are filled with milk and hundreds of dairy products. Cheese, for instance, comes in so many varieties from all continents and for thousands of years.
Chinese ice cream, following a 1400-year-old recipe. An Ethiopian butter gourd. And what would an Indian marketplace be without delicious lassi yogurt?
Cows coming home in Germany. Animals and people in a cultural and nutritional symbiosis. Should all this age-old cultural wisdom now be called into question?
Okay, first of all, drinking milk is obviously not a long tradition because just a few centuries ago the vast majority of adults were lactose intolerant. Thousands of years ago, cows were the animals that would help you plow your field. Eating meat was rare and drinking milk was exceedingly rare. Second, what's the point of keeping different cultures and traditions alive? I know this is a very politically incorrect and unsuitable statement to make. But what do I gain by my native language not being some useful language such as English or Chinese or Russian? By my native language being the useless language called Croatian that few people speak? I don't see I gain anything by that. I see that I had to spend years learning a more useful language that is English. Just let the cultures and the traditions die if they are damaging the economy. Okay? I know this is hard to accept, but that's the reality. Not all languages are valuable, not all cultures are valuable, and much less are all traditions valuable.
Children drinking milk in school. Milk plays such an important role in nutrition that in 2001, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, introduced the World School Milk Day. More than 40 countries participate.
Well, of course, the sugar industry managed to lobby the World Health Organization into claiming that sugar intake of up to around 10% is harmless. That was based on some study done back in 1970s that no nutritionist ever took seriously because it didn't control for another known cause of diabetes, saturated fat intake. And the milk industry has managed into corrupting the World Health Organization into claiming that human beings need to eat large amounts of protein. That's based on some studies which supposedly show a link between type 2 diabetes and low protein intake. If you ask me, such studies are failures in their very conception. One of the basic principles of science is that incoherent hypotheses are not to be tested. And to me it looks like a good example of testing an incoherent hypothesis because if it were true, babies would often get type 2 diabetes since human milk contains very little protein. And that's obviously not true. So yeah, what's taught in schools has little relation to what experts actually believe. And that should be obvious. Now, I mean, here we can see how government policies are made and why they so often fail. They're usually based on some kernel of truth, but assume much of the things that appear to a layman to follow from that kernel of truth, but they don't really. For instance, the vast majority of nutritionists would agree saturated fat causes heart disease. And the government responds to that by basically requiring the milk processing industry to replace some of the fat in milk with sugar. The logic is, if you remove some saturated fat from milk, you will end up with people who consume less saturated fat. Does that make sense? Well, my perception is that nutritionists generally don't agree with that, because it's well known that sugar inhibits the production of leptin, the hormone that makes us feel full when we have eaten enough. Paradoxically, the exact policies that were supposed to make people eat less saturated fat may have resulted in people eating more saturated fat. Similarly, the notion that calcium in food will make our bones and teeth stronger is based on some science. After all, our bones and teeth are made of, among other things, calcium. But there is little to no reason to think making most people, many of which have low vitamin D and vitamin K levels in their blood, eating food fortified with calcium is beneficial, or that it's even safe. It's rather depressing to know those things.
At McMaster University in Canada, Professor Andrew Mente is researching the health benefits of milk consumption. The globally organized Pure research project involves 135,000 people from all socio-cultural backgrounds of the world. Its results are clear.
So higher dairy consumption, particularly whole-fat dairy, is associated with a lower risk of mortality and cardiovascular disease, particularly a lower risk of stroke.
Hey, listen, in a world in which even the companies who sell calcium supplements admit that calcium supplements increase the risk of heart disease, you sound rather silly when you claim milk doesn't. As you probably know, osteoblasts take calcium from your blood to produce calcium phosphate, which makes your bones stronger, but that's a complicated chemical process for which they need vitamin D and vitamin K. Most of the people today don't have enough vitamin D and vitamin K in their blood, and cow's milk doesn't contain enough of those things either. So for most people, not quite all calcium gets into the bones, and some calcium ends up calcifying the cholesterol in the blood vessels. And we all have some cholesterol in our blood vessels, so that leads to atherosclerosis. And milk also has other things that cause heart disease. Milk contains saturated fat, and it also contains large amounts of the only amino acid that's been proven to cause heart disease in humans, methionine. And there are basically two foods rich in methionine that are commonly eaten. It's the sesame seeds and it's the cow's milk and derived products. It's also abundant in insect meat and some types of grass, but since human beings don't eat those things naturally, they aren't resistant to methionine. Now, some people, I guess, think that saturated fat causing heart disease is a disproved hypothesis. It's not. The explanation for saturated fat supposedly not causing heart disease, in spite of obviously raising the cholesterol levels, is that they raise both the low density cholesterol and the high density cholesterol, and that high density cholesterol supposedly protects against heart disease. But here's the thing, high density cholesterol protecting against heart disease is a new idea and it's not really supported by solid evidence. See, there is a nutrient that, to simplify, converts low density cholesterol to high density cholesterol. It's called omega-3 acids. If there was any truth to high-density cholesterol protecting against heart disease, you would expect that the studies have no problem finding that omega-3 supplements protect against heart disease. But there have been quite a few incredibly rigorous studies which tried to prove that omega-3 supplements protect against heart disease, and they all failed. If omega-3 acids don't protect against heart disease, then so doesn't wine, and saturated fat are certainly harmful. Vegetarians are often accused of attempting to use epidemiological nutritional studies to contradict known facts about biochemistry, of trying to use a soft science to contradict a hard one. But who is actually doing that? To me it seems like that's what the milk industry is doing. And I'm sorry for you that you fell on this. I mean, quoting those studies makes it look like they are doing science, when in fact what they are doing is to ditch science in favor of inferior evidence. I am not saying it's only the milk industry that does those things. The claims that the coconut industry makes about nutrition, apart from maybe the claim that coconuts help against epilepsy, are remarkably similar. What I am saying is that those types of claims are all that milk industry has to say in its defense.
Meat and milk taxes are considered, or even bans are requested. But how are cows and climate really related?
The satellite pictures of the European Space Agency ESA help to find answers. They show where there is methane in the atmosphere. Red is more, blue is less methane.
Hey, listen, anybody who has studied global warming has certainly run into this diagram explaining why it's not possible to detect methane using a satellite. At least not the same way it's possible to detect CO2 from a satellite. CO2 emits some electromagnetic radiation of wavelengths that are specific to CO2. Methane, CH4, doesn't do that. The type of electromagnetic radiation that it emits is also emitted by other greenhouse gases, most notably water. So viewers, what do you think is more honest thing to do now? To waste days researching where he got that data from, or do you think it's more honest to simply dismiss the claim, as it's obvious that it contradicts the scientific consensus? Let's move this into another context. When the flat earthers claim their data about the sunrise and sunset time around the world proves the earth isn't a rotating sphere, is it more honest to spend time looking into their claims, or is it more honest to immediately dismiss their claims? I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's almost the same type of reasoning. Here are some dubious statistics which our claim can't be explained by the mainstream science, and that somehow proves I'm right, in spite of the fact that I can't explain those statistics either. I mean, the flat earth theory doesn't even explain the sunrise and sunset, and Peer Ederer is unable unable to explain the statistics he's quoting. The biggest source of methane in the atmosphere are the undersea methanogenic bacteria, famously concentrated in the Bermuda Triangle, which are probably the reason why so many ships explode and sink there. Methane is in the air, and those satellite data that he is quoting appears not to detect it.
Leaky gas pipelines in Russia are easy to spot. And in China, a lot of coal and oil is burned, causing methane emissions.
However, in Brazil, where 212 million animals amount to the largest cattle herd in the world, there are no heightened methane concentrations visible from space.
The same is true for Ethiopia and Sudan, where a total of 96 million cattle are kept, more than all of the European Union.
You realize the biggest producer of the natural gas is the United States by a large margin and not China and India. If your statistics showed the methane leaking from the pumps, one would expect the United States to be red for the large part, rather than China and India. Besides, if methane in the atmosphere is the methane we use, how do you explain the fact that the methane emissions have been decreasing over time, rather than increasing? We are using more natural gas than ever before. We are substituting burning coal for burning methane, for it is more clean. So we would expect the amount of methane in the atmosphere to increase at an accelerated rate, which doesn't happen. If we assume methane in the atmosphere comes by a large part from grass-fed cows, the answer is obvious. There are less and less grass-fed cows around the world.
There are no doubts about the importance of livestock cattle for the nutrition of humans. The main food for cows are grasses, which are made of long and tough carbon chains, the cellulose. Grasses are completely indigestible for humans. Therefore, there is no competition for food between cattle herds and humans.
In a world in which only 9% of meat comes from pastured animals, that argument really doesn't apply. In fact, it's ridiculous. Now it's hard to tell how much milk comes from pasture-raised cows. I think most of the people who have studied the topic would agree it's less than 30%. So this argument also doesn't apply to milk, though it's not as ridiculous. Look, we can have a legitimate discussion about whether it would be, from a sustainability standpoint, better to give up meat altogether or to decrease its consumption by, 90% maybe. But calling for an increase of meat consumption in the world we live today is kind of crazy. Even Nina Teichholz, somebody I have also responded to on this channel about meat, admits that her counter-argument to that is that she supposedly has evidence that consuming meat is essential to public health, and thus that it is justifiable in spite of the ethical and environmental issues connected to eating meat. That's of course not true, but at least it's a somewhat reasonable response.
Research conducted by FAO shows that only 14% of the feed of all livestock would be suitable for human consumption.
And you're implying that's because most cows are fed with grass these days? No, they are fed with grain. But that grain is usually not the grain we eat, because, well, the grain we eat contains little to no fiber, and cows need to eat fiber to survive. Not as much as it's contained in grass, but still they need some amount. When they are fed with grain suitable for humans, well, they need to be supplemented with fiber, and that's more expensive. A much less misleading statistics would be those that show where the grain that's fed to cows is grown. What percentage of that land can be used to grow food for humans, and as it turns out, most of it can be.
Cows turn 20,000 kilograms of feed into 10,000 kilograms of nutritious milk. This shows that dairy production is one of the most efficient methods of producing human food.
And this figure of 2 to 1 feeding conversion rate for cows, I guess, comes from one of those studies that supposedly show how easy it is to make animal agriculture more efficient by feeding cows with grain suitable for human consumption and supplementing them with fiber. Well, I appreciate the concern for feeding the world, but I don't think of people who do those studies even understand the complexity of the problem. I mean, they sound much like Greta Thunberg. It wouldn't address the biggest problem with meat and milk industry, that is the superbacteria. In fact, it would make that even worse. Studies that use real-world data generally show the feed conversion rate for cows today is between 5 and 10. And making it apparently more efficient in that regard most likely won't do anything to solve the hunger in the world, but it will make us more susceptible to superbacteria.
That is why there are so many cows around the world. It also shows that the elimination of livestock cattle would lead to a gigantic hunger and malnutrition crisis on all continents.
There is little doubt that eating meat and drinking milk as it is done today is taking food off our plate. Now, once again, maybe that wouldn't be the case if we increase the amount of meat we eat and the amount of milk we drink a few times, but the statistics are clear that's the case today. And I'm not saying meat is the main reason for hunger in the world. The main reason is probably the anti-capitalist movements hurting exactly the same people they are supposed to help. But eating meat the way it's done today clearly doesn't help.
Ruminants existed already before the Industrial Revolution since millions of years. All these ruminants have always emitted CH4 methane into the atmosphere. The question is, do we nowadays have more ruminants on the planet because of these domestic cattle herds, and therefore we have more methane emissions compared to before the Industrial Revolution?
Of course, we until recently were producing more methane than the natural balance is. Otherwise, the amount of methane in the atmosphere wouldn't have been increasing. It's the same reason CO2 is increasing in the atmosphere. We are increasing the emissions, but we are not increasing the absorption. In fact, we are cutting the absorption of CO2 by deforestation. Now, we aren't exactly decreasing the number of bacteria that can absorb methane, but we have in all likelihood more than doubled the amount of methane in the atmosphere since the 19th century.
It is a mystery how the anti-milk and anti-meat activists can be so absolutely certain that it is necessary to reduce milk and meat consumption in order to save the climate.
Anyway, I'll end this video with a clip from an earlier video where I explain the problem of superbacteria. Dare magnam summam antibioticorum animalibus etiam possibile facit ut aliquae bacteria quae et animalia et homines morbidos faciunt ab antibioticis invulnerabilia fiant. Materia genetica de invulnerabilitate ab antibioticis in paene omnibus bacteriis data est, et ea potest activa fieri. Probabiliter id fit iam hodie. Forsan multos morbus, quae hodie possumus curare antibioticis in futura non poterimus curare, carnem edendi causa.